Hey guys, this is Kaylee Oldacre, and my conference presentation is about the necessity of young adult literature in the secondary English classroom. I was first intrigued by this idea as I thought about my own interest in young adult fiction and my own enjoyment of young adult fiction, and I thought about the vast opportunities and wealth of teaching material that is available in a lot of today's young adult texts. And so I wanted to look into some research and figure out why it's not taught often in secondary English classrooms, or what the perceptions of teaching it are, or what the motives for teaching it are, and how to go about choosing appropriate texts to teach in the classroom, and how to go about teaching young adult literature itself in the classroom alongside other more classical literature, and what all of that entails. So that's kind of where it all started, and so I look forward to sharing with you kind of what I came up with. I did also include my contact information, so as we're going along, if you have questions or you have thoughts or insights, please feel free to email me at either of those addresses. So to start everything off, after looking into the research and thinking through the possibilities, I came up with the idea for my classroom that teaching literature needs to be an essential balance. Young adult literature is necessary. It is so important to teach in the classroom, but classical literature can't be thrown out. There's this great canon of literature that can't be ignored and has great value. And so in looking at young adult literature and its place, I think it is a balance of teaming the two together. As I will show, young adult literature, which is defined often as literature written about adolescents with teen protagonists, it allows a great level of connection for students. Thus, they are more motivated to read. They are more motivated then to do the analysis, to learn about the text in ways in which they do not if they don't feel connected to the work, which often happens with more classical works. And so as I go throughout the presentation, I will show you the ways in which all of these things must be a balance, and it must point back to this essential balance of the literature. So the first thing I looked at was, what are the motivations for teaching literature? Why do we teach literature to students? What is the importance of it? And so there are really two basic camps here, or two motives in teaching literature to young adults. And so first you have this idea of teaching a skill set. So we're teaching students how to analyze, to break apart the structure and the content, to look for theme, to look for meaning, to look at the varied levels of meaning, and all of these things that are this specific skill set to English language arts. But then on the other hand, there's also this desire just to expose students to great works, to important canonical works, to allow them to experience these works aesthetically for what they are. And so Louise Rosenblatt shares these definitions of efferent and aesthetic reading in the article from Angela Bummer-Johnson. I'm sure I'm saying her name wrong. And so she kind of explains the differences here in the two, and that as efferent readers, we are reading to use this information, whereas aesthetic, we are just more participating in the activity. And so I think most motivations for teaching literature stem from the two, and as I mentioned early on, there should be a balance. These should work together. And so oftentimes schools treat literature as efferent text simply to be tested or to gain the information from, rather than these aesthetic literary moments that encourage students as readers. So ironically, the very stance that may encourage lifelong reading, this idea of the aesthetic quality, is rejected as inappropriate for school. And so often a lot of young adult literature is considered more of this aesthetic reading. So while you might gain some enjoyment from it, a lot of people would argue that you are not gaining the ability to apply the efferent skills. And so my argument is that you can do both, that both can exist. So it's the ironic idea there of the catch-22. And so which leads to this next idea that I'm going to talk about of perceptions. and looking at the power that young adult literature has to motivate teenagers to read and read a lot, as well as to make connections to what they read. So young adult literature has these profound motives to encourage readers. And so research into reading and reading comprehension, which harks back to this teaching of skill set, has shown that motivation matters. It is a key part of engaged, successful reading, that is the reader's motivation. And so the next thing I looked into were perceptions. So what are the perceptions of young adult literature in the classroom? A lot of times it is looked at as juvenile or not complex enough, or that it's dumbed down in some way. The literature is not important enough to study in that way. And so often those are the perceptions or the understandings. And educators need the empirical research to back up their desire to use these in the classroom. And so a lot of what I read was really this call to action for researchers to go about this measurable evidence that shows what it's doing for students in the classroom. Because teachers risk losing readers if stereotypes of young adult literature prevent them from introducing this fine literature to their students. So if we allow these perceptions to prevail, then often we are going to lose this whole new community of readers. So we see that both motives and perceptions have a great effect on a new generation of readers, or not, what they may be doing in the classroom or not. And we also know that young adults need to feel a connection to what they're reading. And so Rosenblatt's warnings that readers must find something familiar to connect with in a text, and that too much struggle can alienate them from its meaning. Young adult literature can provide the familiar, or the less alienating literature that Rosenblatt called for, while also meeting the standards of quality that are often ascribed to the classics. And so it is, again, this balance that we can read these works that connect students, but there is also great quality there. It is not just either or, but that both can be found in young adult literature. And so this really brought me to an interesting idea of text complexity. So what makes a text complex, and then at what point is it complex enough to be studied in the classroom? And so I really enjoyed the research here, and I learned a lot as an educator, and I really found that young adult literature is complex literature. Just like classical literature or canonical literature, there's a variety. You get the spectrum, but there is certainly good complex literature to be taught in the classroom that is young adult literature. But I also learned that complexity is not easily measured. And so looking first at the different components, and we'll look at some graphics here in just a second, there are multiple components to text complexity, and the Common Core standards, which is a whole nother discussion, but I do value what they say here about text complexity, identifies it as quantitative, qualitative, and the idea of reader and task. And so I'll look at those specifically here for just a minute. First of all, quantitative is the number score that is often given, the Lexile score, if you're familiar with that terminology, or the grade level categorization. And the problem with evaluating text based solely on a number is that it has been popular for so long that many educators are either unaware of the qualitative evaluation, or the systems established in some schools continue to consider only quantitative evaluation. So there's great value in these Lexile scores. But it can't be the only component that goes into deciding the complexity of the text, as this is more of a straightforward look at the text, and we'll talk about that with the graphic. Whereas qualitative literature is more complicated and is more one-on-one human decision. And so it's made up of levels of meaning, structure, language conventionality and clarity, and its knowledge demands. And so the levels of meaning refers to, are there single or there are multiple levels of meaning? Are they explicitly stated? Are there hidden purposes in the text? Structure talks about the chronology. Does it skip back and forth? What are the genre traits or the unconventional forms? Language conventionality and clarity Is there a figurative or ambiguous language? Is it contemporary or is it archaic? Is it domain specific? And then finally, knowledge demands deal with the familiarity of cultural knowledge, background knowledge, intertextuality. What are we bringing to the text? And so as you can see, qualitative is a lot more complex to decide where it fits on the spectrum. And so then reader and task refers to the individual class assignment. What is the motive in assigning the work? What task is needed here? So looking quickly at these two graphics, you'll see that each component plays the same part. They are all equally important. So you'll see that quantitative measures word length and frequency, sentence length, text cohesion, all of those things. And then we talked about qualitative. And then reader and task talks about student motivation. And you'll see how each of these are determined. Quantitative is determined by an algorithm, whereas qualitative is humans, and specifically the teacher under reader and task. And so looking then more specifically at the qualitative measure, and I know this can be a little hard to see, is this sliding scale of complexity. So dealing with meaning and text structure, language features, knowledge demands, the categories we looked at, and then looking at where it fits specifically on the text, where the text fits specifically on the scale, excuse me. And so it gets a little more complicated, but I think it's worthwhile in looking at text complexity and looking at the ways in which text can be used in the classroom. So the question is, can we establish reading that both engages students and provides them with opportunities to grapple with diverse, sophisticated texts? And so looking through my information, I say that yes, we can. We can certainly find a text that meets these demands. English teachers do not just assign novels, but they also provide the space for critical thinking, engagement, and exposure to multiple perspectives to situations that encourage a critical stance. And so while lots of great canonical literature can do this, I have come to recognize that young adult literature has the infinite possibilities to do this as well. And so the last thing I wanted to take a minute to look at is my own classroom. How might I use this? How might I put these things into practice? And so I took 3 works that would be taught in my classroom: The Outsiders, which I am currently teaching in my classroom; Eleanor and Park, which I have just had the experience of reading; and then Romeo and Juliet, and looking at the ways in which these ideas overlap, as well as the motives for teaching them, the perceptions of each of these works, and the textual complexity of the works. And so I included the Lexile scores there, and obviously you'll see that they're fairly similar. Obviously some are more complicated than others. We would understand why Romeo and Juliet's Lexile score would be higher. But remember, this is just the one figured out by the algorithm. And so then looking at the shared thematic content, or the traditional archetypes, we have these young adult protagonists in each work. We have each of their struggle with identity. We have the role of family dynamics, the coming of age of each of these teens, and then this collision of socioeconomics classes, which is interesting to me as we look at each of these works in their own time, and how they function there as literature. And so I'll argue that good young adult books provide the same opportunities to teach students about these important ideas with protagonists nearer their age, while continuing to teach students important literary elements such as theme, character, etc. In offering students a work that might be more relatable, students more readily connect with the important literary ideas that they must learn with any work. And so while students gain the same understanding of how to go about reading literature and the same appreciation for literature, I believe that with young adult literature, they also often enjoy the process more. And so if you are gaining the same experiences in terms of what students need to know to become college and career ready, then I think there is great value in balancing these texts. I think you could teach this in a variety of ways. You could teach these 3 works as a part of one unit. You could teach them throughout the year, pointing back to similar content, thematic content ideas. You could compare and contrast the decisions these characters make, and you could do a variety of things with these texts. And so I look forward to considering some of these ideas further, but it all comes back to a balance. Additionally, I included a list of sources here, and so if you're interested in reading further, please do so. Please let me know if you have any questions.